I'm Mark Gagan and you're listening to the Voice of Insurance podcast, produced in association with Advantage Go. Pick and choose your own best-of-breed insurtech and data providers with Advantage Go's ecosystem. I really enjoyed today's interview because it's packed full of eureka moments. Sometimes, looking at a business from the outside, it's hard to work out exactly what it does and how and why it does it. Visiting the website of a company of this sort tends to throw up more questions than it answers, and that's frustrating for a journalist, as it's my job to make sense of these things. For me, cyber reinsurance underwriter Envelop Risk was one of those businesses. A bit of a black box that was hard to see into. I had known Jonathan Spry, its CEO, for about 20 years. Jonathan is very smart and has always operated at the high added value end of the insurance value chain, where insurance and reinsurance blur into the capital markets. But in all that time, I had never sat down and had a really long, researched conversation with him. And that's why this is such a satisfying interview. In the next 45 minutes, we dissect Envelop's augmented underwriting business model, looking at its Lloyd's and Bermuda platforms and its machine learning-powered approach to underwriting cyber risk. But this conversation goes way beyond and examines the future of underwriting itself in the global syndicated risk and capital markets, as well as outlining some of the new classes of business that will emerge in the coming decades. Envelop has an appetite way beyond cyber, and this is a really rewarding encounter with someone who understands our business in a more tech and capital savvy way than most of us. At the end of this conversation, I felt like the person who's been allowed deep inside the black box and gets to see how it works and interrogate its way of thinking. Jonathan was on excellent form and was disarmingly open and accessible about Envelop's modus operandi. I feel enlightened for this experience, and so will you. Enjoy the podcast.
Jonathan, welcome to the Voice of Insurance.
Thank you, Mark. It's great to be here.
For anyone who doesn't know you, why don't you tell us a bit about yourself and your career to date?
Well, I suppose I had a bit of a circuitous journey around investment banking and the reinsurance world. And then about 10 years ago, actually, a moment of serendipity, I was introduced to a group of American technologists that had a very similar idea to me about using data and data science to make better decisions about risk. Here we are 10 years later, and we're running Envelop Risk, which I think does exactly that.
You got that idea. Did you end up working with some of those people?
We ended up working together.
So you didn't steal their idea and start your own thing?
Tempting as though that idea might have been, I think it was probably better to just collaborate, and we're all the better for that.
So what's Envelop all about then?
Well, Envelop's an underwriting business, and I guess very similar to many other underwriting businesses in many respects. That the key difference is that we are very data-driven. So we have proprietary technology, that's largely machine learning, and more recently, a few generative AI techniques. Perhaps loosely together, we call that AI, albeit I'm somewhat reluctant to adopt that term. But we're really just using data in a smarter way to make underwriting decisions and capital management decisions in the same way that many other insurers and reinsurers are doing.
And you're in the market. So if there was a broker or any kind of potential customer out there, what would you want them to think when they thought of Envelop?
So I think right now we're already perceived to be one of the leaders in cyber reinsurance. And I think quite correctly, people associate our journey with the growth and development of cyber in insurance. But more generally, I think people would think of us as a leading advocate for data-driven underwriting. And we hear a lot about, particularly in the London market, enhanced underwriting, augmented underwriting, even automated underwriting, perhaps. And we feel we're a good example of a real-world use case of augmented underwriting, which is the term we tend to use.
So why don't you give me a bit of a guided tour? You've got platforms in Lloyd's, Bermuda, you've got different relationships. Imagine I was sort of the intern on the first day round and you were showing me all the different parts of your empire and saying, well, this goes over here, this does that, this works with that, and this bone's connected to that bone. Give me the tour of how it all works, how it all fits together. Because there's quite a lot of moving parts with Envelop.
There probably are a few moving parts, but I would start in the middle of the business, which is the flywheel. Everybody these days needs a flywheel. Our flywheel is a data flywheel. More, better data equals more business brings you more data. And everything we do is really driven by that idea that we're on this quest to use that data in a smart way. I like to think we have a bit of a vision, a bit of a mission around filling protection gaps. And what we're doing is just evolving a business model that allows us to leverage other balance sheets, as well as some of our own risk-taking capital, to bring the best of all of that underwriting and capital management prowess to bear so that we can service our clients, we can bring bigger deals, we can transfer more risk, and ultimately fill some of those protection gaps.
And what sort of balance have you got between your own capital and the capital you manage on behalf of others?
Well, we would always be a minority part of our capital, but it's material. I think it varies by platform, maybe in the sort of 10 to 20% range, maybe a bit higher in Lloyd's at the moment. I don't think there's a magic number for how much capital you should have at work. I think 100% and 0% are wrong numbers. I really believe in skin in the game as meaning alignment beyond just a kind of profit commission inherent to an MGA arrangement. I think you need to go a little bit further than that. Your balance sheet partners actually don't want to see you suffer, but they certainly like to think that you will experience a little bit of pain if they're experiencing pain. And I don't think we have a problem with that. At the same time, it is for obvious reasons that those that feel they've got the expertise and have a niche and have an application which can be applied to a number of different capital partners, it would just be silly, I think, to think that we would ever be a single balance sheet partner. And clearly, the direction of travel in our industry has been more and more towards MGA-like business models, but with varied platforms of capital and a bit of perhaps a capital allocation process, which is something that we're really keen on.
And obviously, you spent your whole career, prior to Envelop, at that very high end where the capital and reinsurance part of the food chain is interacting with insurance. So you know exactly how to fit those structures. So it sounds like, would it be fair to say something like, it's kind of good to have a reasonable line on your own slip, if you see what I mean, so that everyone else can see that you're participating about as much as they are. And so it'll hurt you as much as it hurts them.
I think that's exactly right. And there's nothing new in that. I mean, that's a tradition that we've had in London for hundreds of years, probably. There's some really good research, probably not enough research about what skin in the game really means, what alignment means. And we can all go away and digest some of that. But I do feel that we're getting closer to the answer in the insurance industry. We have underwriters that are not just willing, but I think quite keen to demonstrate personal alignment with their results. And frankly, if you're doing a good job, why not eat a bit of your own economics? If this is good risk, you're observing the trading signal, go and trade, but align yourself to the economics. I think actually that's a win-win situation.
I think you're absolutely right there. And also it gives you that flexibility again, because, things are always changing. If you have the ability to retain more, sometimes if you need to as well, then that's also just the way the market is. Sometimes you do need to be able to retain more. And if you were just a pure MGA, you couldn't retain anything. So it would be difficult.
Absolutely right. Correct.
You've got relationships. You've got that platform at Lloyd's, which you've already mentioned, and in Bermuda. The relationship you've got with Apollo, Syndicate, and MS Re, can you run us through how all that works?
We would view both MS Re, which is part of the MSAD group, used to be the MS Amlin business, the reinsurance part of that business that we all know very well. And then Apollo Underwriting, which is a Lloyd's business, a Lloyd's Syndicate managing agent, but one that has begun to demonstrate a real fondness of the innovation end of the spectrum. They have a syndicate, which is a innovative syndicate, innovative risk, which is sometimes referred to as the IBOT syndicate, 1971. Yep. That's the syndicate that we've been working with. But both MS Re and Apollo, we really view those as strategic partners. We certainly don't just view them as balance sheet providers, albeit it was really important in the choice of both partner that they wanted to take some of the risks themselves, but were equally happy and keen to see us taking the risk. So there's a real risk-sharing element to both relationships. MS chiefly concerned with our Bermuda platform, Apollo really mostly concerned with our London platform. We keep the two slightly separate. The underwriters regulated entities in both territories, but we have a global coordination around capital allocation and the modeling, but the underwriting platforms are kept deliberately a little bit separate. And what that means is we have real expertise and real underwriters in both platforms, and we're actually just growing both underwriting teams at the moment. But one thing that has been observed about Envelop is that we are much more driven towards augmented underwriting, as we've noted, and the use of technology. So we're a little bit leaner when it comes to building out the human element of our team. But I really do want to state how important we find human underwriting, and particularly looking for underwriters that are maybe a little bit more technical than average, but are true believers in the use of the machine, but not necessarily looking to make themselves redundant. And we see a big role for the human to play in that augmentation. So yeah, MS and Apollo, the two strategic partners we have, and both go well beyond just the kind of capacity provision. We are engaged with other services. We talk a lot about technology and data to both partners, and both have been incredibly supportive to us in our growth over the last several years.
And I suppose augmented, it does imply there needs to be a human in the loop there, because nothing to augment. I suppose you're augmenting the human there, aren't you?
That's right. So it's pretty straightforward. It's the augmentation of human underwriting with data. In anticipation of your next question, Mark, I don't see the human being removed from the loop completely, which may come as a relief to some of your listeners. Maybe some would be keen to see the human removed. Who knows? But we're big believers in getting the best out of the machine often involves the human there, and vice versa. We've seen other industries which I think have landed on that as the right model. I'm not saying that there aren't parts of the insurance value chain that will be completely automated. And I believe that is a real opportunity or threat, depending on how you look at it. But for what we do, specialty underwriting, reinsurance underwriting, I cannot see the human being removed from that in the foreseeable future.
No, I suppose because also that client is very human as well. You know, if they're looking for you to set some lead terms, they might be able to tie up the rest of the market once those lead terms. But if you're negotiating something very specialist, one presumes it's also a human doing it on the other end of the line.
Yeah, agreed. And I think there are still a number of areas of the underwriting process, including the relationship management of the client and the broker management, that benefit from the human role. But I think there are other aspects of underwriting where the machine still hasn't quite stolen a march on the human. And actually, human judgment has its flaws, but some of what we do in terms of thinking about market cycles, competitive analysis, through the cycle underwriting, I actually think that the human is generally got a better sense of that than much of what we see from machine learning. I think where machine learning is particularly good is portfolio level analysis, and particularly hypothesis testing, where it doesn't require the human to come up with a handful of scenarios or a handful of hypotheses as to what future may look like. It actually can just generate a huge number of stochastic outcomes, hundreds of thousands, without too much human interaction. And then the human really is using that as a toolkit. It's there to set the confidence intervals and to think about capital in a much more refined and accurate way. But clearly that is not the only task of the underwriter. And that's why we see this as just sensible augmentation rather than automation as such.
And actually, in terms of humans, what sort of headcount are you up to, and what sort of GWP have you been writing?
I think in total, the business is something like 70 full-time employees, 65, 70, something like that. Underwriting volumes, I mean, in aggregate, well over $1 billion now, $1 billion point something. And on an annual basis, north of 250 million this year. And I think we, pretty clear path to underwriting in that sort of 500 million to $1 billion range in the not too distant future, just depending on market opportunity, really.
We know you as a cyber underwriter and cyber reinsurance underwriter. Is that exactly how you always should be known? And could you be diversifying into other classes? And if so, what sort of classes would they have to have certain characteristics about them? Obviously, one characteristic of cyber, of course, is tons of data, and it's also a naturally growing, an organically growing class because it's still not quite mature yet.
I think that's exactly the right way to answer the question. So there is nothing stopping us from moving beyond cyber. We believe that there are huge opportunities to apply data-driven underwriting in other classes of business. The reason we haven't to date is just timing of market cycles, looking at opportunities to actually be relevant. And clearly, we're all aware that the market is somewhat softer in reinsurance than perhaps it was when we set up. We always built a business that we thought would be somewhat agnostic as to whether we're in a hardening or softening market. We're typically focused on rate adequacy and risk selection, but there's no point denying that market cycles have an impact on supply and demand and whether or not it makes any sense for us to participate elsewhere. All of that said, I'd be surprised if Envelop is not underwriting in other classes within a year or two. A number of things have been under active consideration. But you're quite right that what we're looking for are types of reinsurance business that share data characteristics with cyber, because that's what we're used to doing. So we actually quite like complex risk, sentient risk, perhaps a human element to things. It's quite interesting. Risk which is constantly changing, adaptive, probably means you're more in the intangible world than the tangible world, and almost certainly areas where historic claims data or actuarial data is not going to be a good predictor of the future, and that you almost require the more forward-looking elements of machine learning to increase your confidence in the outcome, and I think pick up on trends very quickly and adapt quickly to those trends, which is something we've proven is possible in cyber, but should be equally possible in other areas of liability, probably specialty reinsurances, and particularly those that have that kind of human element to them.
So it's definitely more casualty than property, although to be fair, of course, property has become a much less static risk than it used to be, given that, the rise of all the secondary perils, wildfires just popping up everywhere. Things are quite dynamic these days. Of course, the wind's always been dynamic. It's got more dynamic.
Yeah. I don't think there's any reason to think that the lines are blurring a little bit as well, and that the physical world is now so much more connected. And we actually see a lot of cyber physical risk, and it's something we model, something we think about, something I say we have some appetite to underwrite is the cyber physical world and the blurring of the line between the intangible and the tangible. And I also agree that the risk that wildfire, for instance, a good example, present are very different from the kind of historic event catalogues that are perhaps used in property cat underwriting.
Yeah, I mean, you wouldn't expect to have wildfires very often in Scotland, but,
Right.
Anything can happen these days. You have a dry spring, bang, and things you would not expect to happen.
Completely right. Black swans so frequent now. We're waiting for the white swan, and then we'll all be surprised.
But generally, though, you're interested in classes that would have lots of data available to them and have that dynamic characteristic and that kind of, oh my goodness, sense that the standard underwriter who's going to ask you for the 10-year loss record before they do anything won't be able to look at, because they won't have the means to try and understand something that doesn't necessarily quite have a loss record yet, or that loss record is absolutely no predictor of what will happen in the future.
Yeah, completely. And I suppose the only other element to this would be the protection gap or emerging risk feature. So really like to try and use reinsurance as a way to open up the insurance industry. So actually, we believe reinsurance and data and analytics, all the things we do, are actually just infrastructure for insurance. It's fundamental infrastructure. So I think a part of what Envelop believes its mission to be, its role, is to underpin and facilitate the growth, sensible, sustainable growth in insurance. And ideally, that means we can then go and plug protection gaps. And to do that, we know we have to use different capital sources. So it's one reason that we're already using funds at Lloyd's, we're using traditional rated capital, we're using ILS capital, and we want to open that up to more and more capital markets, because I think without the capital markets, we won't be able to close the protection gaps that we see. And the capital markets require people that are able to manage capital, and that often means in a quantitative fashion, but it means that we can look at things like TVAR and marginal TVAR, portfolio optimization, which are perhaps not things you would normally expect an MGA to be engaged with. But this is sort of DNA of Envelop. It's to act very much with a capital management focus in our day-to-day life.
And TVAR, that would be the total value at risk, when it's much more the sort of thing that someone on Wall Street would be talking about rather than on Lime Street.
Yeah, it's the tail value at risk. So it's the tail risk metric.
Tail risk.
And it's quite right, though, what you say, that this is terminology that's probably more familiar to Wall Street and the investment world. I'm pretty sure the CROs, those calibrating Solvency II models, are probably familiar with these concepts. But it's good to start to think about the underwriter, not just in terms of terms and conditions and pricing risk, but actually their role is to allocate capital. And I think we've given them a toolkit that allows them to operate as a capital optimizer, a capital allocator, which maybe that's a little bit new for the underwriter.
I remember when I was a young broker in the early 90s, I wandered into an underwriter's office. I hadn't met him before, and he said, well, how long have you been in high finance? And I thought, I'd never thought of it as being high finance. But I think the longer you sort of interact with it and the bigger picture you understand or you get of insurance in the value chain, you see how, of course, it is high finance. Everything is the allocation of capital one way or another, and helping people get a better return on that capital and protect that capital So yeah, ultimately it is a very good way of looking at insurance. And of course, it's probably a very good way of allocating those resources. I'm going to allocate them where I get the better return on capital. And that means a better price risk.
I really agree with what you've said there, Mark, because what you're touching on, I think, is really, really important, which is the importance of the insurance industry demonstrating its benefit to society and actually servicing a need, and equally to demonstrate that the type of international global finance that we're concerned with is complex. London really at the heart of it, Bermuda too, and we should be really shouting about the opportunities within the industry. We're now using data science in a much more sensible way, which I think is actually going to help us with this sort of talent issue that perhaps the industry has had over the years, where maybe it isn't the first choice of industry for the top grads from around the world. And actually, I really think that the more technology-enabled businesses, such as Envelop, are a really big part of the solution to getting a more diverse group of talent, the top talent, but talent from maybe less traditional sources and people with different ideas and different skill sets. And actually what we can do is put the insurance industry right at the top of attractive destinations for people to come and work. And I've never used the expression high finance, but maybe we should.
It's quite a quaint old-fashioned term.
It's a lovely term, isn't it? Yeah, but maybe one that we can reinvent.
Well, it's that multiplier effect. And I suppose if we're going to crack these protection gaps, well, if we do, of course, we can multiply the size of the insurance industry by many-fold. And therefore, as long as we maintain a similar level of profitability, we will multiply our profits many-fold. And hopefully we won't have to multiply our headcount by quite the same multiplier. But at the same time, there will be more jobs and there'll be better jobs and they'll be better paid. There'll be more interesting jobs. That's only got to be a good thing.
I think so. And, let's not dodge the difficult question. We're probably employing fewer underwriters than we might have done as a business if we'd adopted a completely traditional approach. But these are underwriters that may not exist at all if we weren't doing this, closing protection gaps. We're growing our industry. And equally, we're employing lots and lots of data scientists, and we're employing software engineers, and we're employing people in operations and in capital and capital management. And we have our own growing team that does the capital markets side of things. So these are really value-added roles that are being created, and they're being created because of the possibilities that are now afforded by, call it AI or the use of data. And so we shouldn't just be fearful that the arrival of technology companies in EC3 or Bermuda or wherever we may be is here just to sweep out and make a whole load of people redundant. Actually, no, we're building a new industry which is going to employ high-quality people. I think that's only a good thing.
You mentioned about cyber and getting into ILS. And again, I suppose the definition of the maturity of a class of business, if it can get as far as ILS, it must mean that people in very high echelons of the capital world are comfortable with that industry, that for one, it is able to define an event and is able to quantify that event and work out how likely that severe event is to happen. Would you agree that it's a clear sign of maturity? And how much more mature is it likely to get with cyber?
I agree. So I think the utilization of ILS is a sign of maturity. But you could also say, well, there hasn't been much cyber ILS. So you're maybe an adolescent now, but you're not very mature. Maybe that's fair. A lot more that could be done, of course. Whether the traditional or somewhat traditional model of the 144A cat bond, which works so well for property cat, is that the right model of ILS for cyber? Slightly more complex. It's probably slightly longer tail, albeit, as you've noticed, the tail in property cat is perhaps not quite what everybody thought it was some years ago.
I think all tails are longer than most people think they are.
Indeed. Long tails seem to be everywhere we look now. So I think the model needs to evolve a bit. I think there's a bit of a build it and people will come phenomenon. There's equally, if we have more capital, we do more for it, and you get that sort of chicken and egg scenario. But I do still feel we need to be really clear that cyber is still underserved by the insurance industry. The opportunity is still enormous for growth. Penetration of SMEs in the US has grown and grown, but it's still a relatively low percentage that are affording themselves the protection of insurance. And beyond the US, even less, of course. Interesting that we get high-profile events. The M&S event recently, if nothing else, brings more attention back. They were obviously sensible in buying insurance. They've been very comfortable to talk about the value that that insurance brings them, including, I think, testifying to politicians of that. And I think that's all useful because this is a product that perhaps people have viewed as slowing down a bit in growth. Maybe that's true, but is still amongst the fastest growing, and I think probably is the fastest growing class of insurance, and a huge protection gap that there is still to fill.
It's interesting about that chicken and egg situation. So, and you've said before about you believing reinsurance in the capital markets and the high end, that high finance world being the engenderer of some of these classes. So you can build it, get that capital in place, and then it will come, and then more insurance will be transacted to follow.
It's both, right? So, yeah. I mean, it's sort of iteration, isn't it? We show more opportunity, more capital gets interested. They believe they can do things at scale. They become even more interested. And let's not kid ourselves, right? This is an alternative asset, and alternative asset allocations are always going to be, if you think about a typical sort of endowment investor, they're going to have some percentage that goes into alternative assets, of which only a percentage will go into insurance related. But even if you add all of that up, it's material. And I think we need to remind ourselves that there's a complexity premium, maybe a liquidity premium that has to be offered when it comes to complex risk like cyber. But that still gives a return on capital. It diversifies portfolios, and we can meet people's return expectations. But many of them will just need to see adequate supply for them to give the effort to understanding it. And clearly you have to take people a little bit on that journey. And I think Envelop Risk thinks we can assist at least a bit in facilitating that. So we can manage vehicles. We don't expect the investor to have to make every single decision within their location, if you like. So we have a lot of discussions with investors, and some of those are come back when this is a $10 billion opportunity. Some are more willing to put their toe in the water. But I think the capital is there if we can get this right.
Let's have a discussion about any of those other new classes that we talked about earlier. Obviously, there's a lot of excitement around some of the net zero emerging classes, for example. Do you think they might be appealing to you? Or also been reading recently, there seems to be quite a lot of buzz around ensuring AI itself, or the efficacy of AI, or the errancy of AI, although that would probably already be silently included in most professional indemnity covers and general liability covers as well, because it's not specifically excluded yet. Basically, yeah, it's a generalized question to ask, what classes are exciting you at all?
Yes, I am certainly excited by the opportunities in the decarbonisation world, new energy and so on. I think the green industrial revolution will need insuring, just like every industrial revolution has ever needed insuring. And we shouldn't ignore that opportunity. So definitely, and a good protection gap. I think the AI liability is an even bigger opportunity, an even bigger subject, probably at least one podcast worth of discussion there, if not more. And it's happening now. So we've seen the arrival of a few dedicated AI liability MGAs, some technology platforms as well. I've taken a look at some of this recently, and there's some pretty sensible stuff going on, actually. I don't think this is a flash in the pan. I think we will see AI liability needed to be taken very seriously within the insurance industry. It's a great opportunity as well. I suspect it starts as quite a sort of silent issue, in as much as it's not just going to be a standalone insurance policy here. You're going to find this creeping into liability, and people need to be, and particularly reinsurers need to be quite focused on that potential for silent AI liability. We also see the arrival of a huge amount of growth in agentic AI. So more than just sort of task-capable operational use of AI, but AI agents that are now performing far more complex tasks that involve seemingly some level of decision-making or iteration. That itself brings with it quite a lot of risk, actually, because there's all of the risk of getting it wrong, miscalibration, the hallucinations that we sometimes hear about chatbots or otherwise might be making. But equally, there's a lot of data flowing in and out of those models, and there are legitimate security concerns. So there are cyber security concerns in the growth of agentic AI. But it's getting us to a point where we sort of see AI as being a bit of a sword and a shield. So the reason Envelop would think that this is relevant to us is that we have a toolkit which allows us to understand this type of risk, because we're an AI or data-orientated company. So it's not a huge struggle for us to say we can think about AI liability as being quite similar to some of what we've been thinking about for cyber for 10 years. So I really welcome the arrival of new startups. Equally, I think the incumbent insurers and syndicates and reinsurers will need to get their head around this opportunity pretty quickly. And I'd love to think there's a way for Envelop to propel the opportunity and not just think of this as a threat, but definitely to see that there's real business, a protection gap. And if we can propel that by bringing our analytics or bringing our capital or our reinsurance or both, then we would be really keen to do that.
Do you think it's going to end up being an exclusion, a bit like we ended up with the cyber terrorism kind of clarification at the very least? I was reading, for example, a very interesting piece on Insurance Insider about a famous case, I think in the UK, where a solicitor got the AI to do his homework for him and filed a load of fictitious jurisprudence as part of the filing on behalf of a client. That sounds to me like it would be difficult to exclude, because that could easily have just been an intern who made up a load of stuff. Almost if you treat that AI as an employee, and employees occasionally go off the rails, you'd say, well, that's what I'm here for. It was that whoever actually signed that off and sent that into the court wasn't necessarily doing their job very well, which again is just good old-fashioned E&O or PI type risk, isn't it?
Exactly right, Mark. So yes, I think people will exclude some of these risks. I would hope then that we see those exclusions as an affirmative opportunity. So we then create endorsements, add-ons, separate covers, separate section, whatever it might be, that can pick up some of that risk. We can price it. It's legitimate. It's not an uninsurable risk. It's just one that needs to have premium allocated to it. I think that's fair. So yes, there will be a role for exclusion, but definitely I agree. In professional indemnity, people at work maybe are being offered the co-pilots that we now see, whether that's co-pilot with a capital C or a small c, but we're using these tools, chatbots, we're all doing it to a degree. Is your employer going to be able to avoid liability inherent in that? Not really. Is the insurer going to be able to exclude all of that? I wouldn't have thought so. So it's time to acknowledge that risk, price it, model it, understand it. There's no such thing as a bad risk, right, Mark? You know this, and it's a bad premium or a lack of premium that's the problem.
I suppose, when they invented telephones, I'm sure liability underwriters were worried about people. Oh, no, that means everyone's just going to agree things on the phone. No one's going to remember to write it all down, and then we have loads of disputes. And of course we did. And of course, this is just a new way of working. So therefore, if you embed a new way of working into how you work and what your output is, then I suppose you're still liable for what the output is. You can't just pretend that it's not you, if you see what I mean. I mean, people are legally responsible generally for what they do and what they do to others.
Completely. And that's part of the fun of the industry, isn't it? And the musical chairs a bit around risk, but there's a role for that. We have to get it right. We need to think about wordings very, very carefully. But ultimately, it's our job to pick up this risk, put a price on it. If we need to transfer it ourselves or engage in a little bit of syndication of that risk, we should do that. We should think about the capital markets as well. But let's not confuse a massive opportunity with just a problem that we hope will go away. Problem isn't going to go away. And let's get our heads around it.
Obviously, you're augmenting your underwriters and using AI, data, whatever you want to call it, for that. Most of it doesn't sound like it's particularly agentic because you're leaving the human to be the agent. In your experience, what have been the best techniques? What techniques are using AI bring the most augmentation, make the underwriter happiest and most productive and better?
So most of what we do from day one, but including right up until now, is built on supervised machine learning. And machine learning has been around for quite a long time, actually has been used in real world applied commercial situations outside of the insurance industry, particularly for a very, very long time. And nobody would launch a satellite or build a new fighter jet without using advanced regression analysis, without thinking about all of the data that's available. Civil engineering would be another example. It's better to test bridges without killing people and doing that within a lab or a simulated environment. So none of this is particularly new. What's new is the attention that has been brought to AI, particularly by the arrival of neural networks, the large language models, obviously the most famous example, which has brought us this world of generative AI. But most of what Envelop does, actually, and most of what the underwriters are using is the more GOFAI, we call it, good old-fashioned AI, largely machine learning. But that said, we found the generative AI really, really useful in things like exposure management, name matching, really dull topic. I mean, if I keep talking about it, your listeners will switch off. But actually, the nominally important part of reinsurance is to make sure you're modeling your actual exposure, not whatever patchy data allows you to think your exposure might be. And we found some very smart ways of using the commercially available foundational models built for that with semantic reasoning, the ones we're familiar with, and perhaps some that we're less familiar with. That allows us to actually engage in some quite sophisticated name matching and exposure management, which we would not have been able to do a few years ago. So I guess we're icing the cake a little bit with more recent sexy generative AI, but the fundamentals of what we've been doing for 10 years is machine learning.
So it's all about giving that underwriter the absolutely best, clearest picture of the risk that's in front of them so they can really understand it and really price it properly.
Yeah, and allowing them under the hood, I think, is important as well. So you could have the most amazing model in the world, but if it's a black box and the underwriter's just sort of input, output, sort of on desktop or something, that's not going to be as powerful and as effective as having a model where the underwriter is actually encouraged, forced even, to become part of the architecture and the engineering of the model. So help calibrate the model, question some of the assumptions, sit next to the data scientists and ask them a bunch of questions about why the results are where they are. And if the underwriter is willing to do so, challenge that. And we would encourage that. We encourage a healthy process of challenging each other's ideas and bringing competitive pressure between the machine and the human underwriter. That's almost an obligation to sort of dissent a little bit from what the machine tells you. And that brings better results. So we're all in a high trust environment where we feel we can express our views and challenge a little bit some of the orthodoxy of underwriting, but equally some of the model output too.
Yeah, because I suppose if you don't engage with it, you may just see it as some opaque thing. It's come up with a number 5.3. You don't know why it said 5.3. You think it's probably 3.8. You can't really have that dialogue with it unless you've been used to talking to it and helped trained it in the first place, I suppose.
That's right.
You may obviously come to the point where you totally discount it, or either you totally discount it or you totally rely on it, when probably either of those are probably the wrong thing. So, and how much transparency can you get into that model output? You know, the kind of showing your work inside of things, which is always the interesting part of, you know, why do I think this? Why do I think what I think? That's the interesting part, because you can then challenge those assumptions.
So internally, it's completely transparent because we don't license anyone else's models. It's all proprietary. So the underwriter can literally go through thousands of lines of code if they wish to. I'm not saying that they would do that in the normal run of business and time consuming for one reason, but they can pick away at the code. They can pick at the way at the data sets. They can think about what weighting the answer has. So we can get to why it's 5.2, not 3.8 or whatever it is. The challenge comes a little bit when we begin to partner with other organizations. But because this is not a sort of SaaS, right? We don't do AI as a service. We're never going to just turn up and say, right, here you are, here's your API, you're in our model, but that's it, black box, we'll just give you the outputs. Even the partner businesses we have are able to come in and open the lid and have a real look at what's going on. And I think that's really because the modeling is bespoke. We're not selling a homogenous sort of product to thousands of customers. We're working in a much deeper environment of technology transfer with a select handful of partners. And that allows much greater flexibility, more kind of made to measure feel to everything we do compared to one of the vendor models. And I have a huge belief in the role of vendor models. If we don't have models that were pretty commonly used, we don't have starting points for the conversation. We don't get as much trading of risk, which is really important. So the work that the bigger vendor model firms do, including in cyber, is really, really important. But what we're doing is perhaps just a little bit more focused on the needs of the reinsurance capital compared to the insurance capital.
So would it be fair to say that your investment in AI has mostly been around improving the skill of those underwriters rather than necessarily their productivity? Because you're at that sort of level of the market where it's not as if, you know, if you were in sort of SME business, it's important to get thousands of quotes out within 30 seconds. You're not in that world, are you? It sounds like you're more in the, I would much rather improve my loss ratio by 5 points.
Well, I agree. And that's definitely characterized the journey to date. But actually, I don't think Envelop would be done with our journey if we don't achieve the second chapter, if you like, which is the efficiency. So I think our purpose is actually to make better decisions. So shave those valuable points off the loss ratio through the cycle. But actually, we're not done doing that. I think we need to be more efficient as well. And we're highly engaged at the moment with some discussions around algorithmic underwriting. So just going into the smart follow world, whether that's for our own book of business or a toolkit for some of our partners. And actually still in human there involved, but far less even there in intervention. And part of the reason for that is not just to beat the market price, so, you know, generate positive returns, generate alpha, if you like. It is also to operate more efficiently. So I want to be able to look our capital partners in the eyes and say, I've done a good job here, we've done a good job here of shaving a few points off a loss ratio, but we've also taken a few points off your expense ratio. And thanks to that, your return on capital is really exciting now compared to maybe if you'd just taken an average punt, taken the market, taken the index or whatever.
That's why you're the CEO, because you want to have both. You don't want to have either or. Let's have both. Thank you very much. And of course, it's quite capable of delivering both. Yes, interesting you're talking about that follow world. I mean, are you interested as being a follower yourself, or do you see yourself more as a leader and you want to enable that follow capital in behind your expertise?
I'm going to really thank you for that question, Mark, because I don't believe at the corporate level you should ever decide that you're a leader or a follower, because most people will immediately decide they're leaders. And I think what's really interesting within particularly the Lloyd's syndicate world is just how many classes of business have so many leaders. And actually, if you just do the maths, they're not really all leading, are they? And I think the real truth is that we need to double down at a syndicate level on the stuff we're good at and grow our books in the areas we can demonstrate true leadership. And we should all be very pragmatic about the smart follow opportunity. And it's better to follow smart, follow efficiently, but just to recognize you're not going to be a leader in every single class of business, and then just be really, really good at where you are a leader. And I suppose what's going to happen is that we're going to bifurcate a little bit more between syndicates leading and syndicates following, and not just pretending to anybody that they're leading everything. And I think that that's a welcome development. I think that that will mean better returns on capital, better efficiency across the market. And I think it's data and the use of data science that will actually be the arbiter of who's leading and who's following. And of course, I would love Envelop to lead as much as we can, but I'm pretty pragmatic and I would rather smart follow where I think we should be following rather than just delude anybody that we're leading in every single class of business. I think this is going to be a conversation that is one of the most important differentiators of the growth and the evolution of underwriting globally, but I think particularly here in London.
Well, in the market, ultimately, I mean, you're still underwriting. You're all taking on a risk for a premium, and you're saying yes or no, and saying how much capital you would put to risk at that price and on that risk. So whether you're the leader or the follower, everyone's on their deal, and everyone should be happy with that deal, and they should only write it because they want to write it, obviously. And whether that makes you a leader or a follower, who actually cares ultimately. But if you are an absolute expert in that field, then those clients and those brokers will always beat a path to your door because they know that you are a great assessor of that risk and you are a good market maker in that risk. You can make a good price and your price is likely to get home, I suppose, is also the ultimate test, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly that, Mark. How long it will take to evolve to that model, I'm not sure. Will it ever happen completely? Will we see monoline syndicates again? I doubt that, actually. But there's no reason to think you can't be good at half a dozen things and then just be willing to participate on another dozen in a smart way, right?
So, yes, do you think mathematically you do have to diversify then, Jonathan?
Well, the question is, should the market diversify? Of course. Should each syndicate diversify? What's the point if the capital providers are participating on different syndicates? It's a very complex question because the answer isn't the same for different capital providers. So the best way to answer it is probably a fudge, which is you should have some diversification at the syndicate level. But equally, there's a lot of economic impetus rationale for having strong concentrations, which themselves will diversify across the market with a spread of risk. So I think that's probably the best way of viewing it.
Yes, you can buy diversification by just buying a ton of reinsurance from a diversified group of different people from all over the world. I mean, that's diversification in the same mathematical sense, isn't it?
Exactly. And or if you're a foul provider, even a traditional name, it's very unlikely you're going to participate on a single syndicate. The members agents will show you a range of syndicates to participate on. That's how you get your diversification. And the market itself obviously has diversification. I think the question is, do you expect each syndicate participation to have a high level of diversification? Maybe, maybe not.
One thing I noticed looking at your website, you've got a tech and advisory business within your group. How did that come about? And is there any rationale behind that? Or just that you're experts in certain things and people seek you out?
It was exactly that. I think we did tell the market that we were going to set up the business. We now call it Envelop Risk Solutions. It has been entirely reactive so far. Maybe in the future we'll be a bit more kind of salesy about this. But we're asked a bunch of questions by balance sheet partners and by clients as to whether we could help them a little bit with some modeling. Typically, it was not exactly build us a pricing model because they all had pricing models, but it was perhaps how do you calibrate pricing models? can you share a bit of your threat intelligence? You seem to be very forward looking. Let us know what's going on. And then maybe sort of say, well, how would we optimize a portfolio? Or our portfolio in cyber is quite small now. We'd like to grow it. How would we do that? So I would say it's probably an advisory offering, platform perhaps, but not really a sort of software SaaS question. So it's a bit at the moment, well, let's see where we get with that. I think it's quite complementary to the underwriting business. I don't see it ever substituting what we do in underwriting. We're not about to become a software provider as our chief driver of revenue, but it just seemed sensible to undertake those conversations given we knew that we could add value. And that's what we see our purpose as being, is sort of adding the value, helping people. We're really a partnership model business. We're not of the view that the reinsurers, the insurers, the syndicates are competitors. We kind of see ourselves building relationships with our chosen partners and helping them innovate and finding sort of judicious two-way streets in terms of technology advice, capital, and so on. So I really believe in partnership at the real DNA of the business, actually.
So it just follows along, and it's very high-end kind of stuff. It's very kind of C-level stuff. So it's not like as if you're sort of trying to sell CD-ROMs or anything.
Yeah, correct.
You've been very entrepreneurial to set up this business and have so much success and scale it and be on the cusp of scaling even more. Jonathan, what sort of entrepreneur are you? Would you want to take Envelop all the way and sponsoring the Super Bowl or something like that?
That's a good question. So I don't think you'll ever see a Spry insurance company, but I think there's a long way to go with Envelop. I mean, two things. I think we could be much, much bigger. We could be doing a lot more. We will be bigger and doing more in the future. But what I would say is that this is not a one-man band, and I would expect Envelop to thrive with or without me, frankly. I don't have a plan to be a serial entrepreneur in the insurance industry. I think there's a lot more we can do here, and then others will take this business forward. I would hope it would long outlive me, and that really would be the legacy I'd be looking for, is to leave something that's a long-term sustainable business that everybody knows about in our industry. I don't think we really care whether we're sponsoring Super Bowls and things, but it's something which we want the insurance industry to buy into, and we're not really a consumer brand. So I think that would be enough as a legacy. If we're trillions in capital and many billions in premium, not so worried about the Super Bowl, to be honest.
No. So it doesn't sound like you've got any kind of fixed end point in your mind. Some people have some kind of goal or say, well, actually, if I get this far, I'll probably stop.
Yeah, but does anybody ever meet those goals? Is it important to have that? I mean, I genuinely don't. So one day I won't be running Envelop and Envelop will be fine, but I have no idea when that day is. And it's not going to be in the next few weeks. Who knows after that? So,
Jonathan, I've really enjoyed talking to you. Thanks so much for answering all the questions very frankly, and some of the ones that necessarily weren't on my list actually just occurred to me as we were talking. It's been one of those kind of conversations where a lot of new ideas happened by listening to what you're saying, because, there's a lot going on. So because there's so much going on, we need to make a date at some point in the future for you to come back, give us a full update because it sounds like things are developing at great speed. So thanks so much for all your time, sort of to drag you away from this big project.
Not at all. I really enjoyed it, Mark. We've spoken so much over the years. This is the first time we've ever done a podcast like this. I've actually enjoyed it. So I would be thrilled to come back if you would have me and join that illustrious, august group of individuals that get a second bite of the cherry.
Absolutely. Well, I'd say Envelop time is slightly different, a different time scale than everyone else. Time goes quicker on Planet Envelop.
That's probably right. Indeed.
So yes, I think we will have to get you back soon, because I'm sure I'll be scanning the headlines. I'll see, wow, they've just done this, they've just done that, they've just done that. Well, I need to get Jonathan back on to talk about all this new stuff they're doing. So I'm really looking forward to that date already. But in the meantime, thanks for coming on the show, and all the best.
I really enjoyed it. Thank you, Mark.
Well, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you did, don't forget to subscribe or leave a like or a review or recommendation on whatever podcast platform you used to access this programme. These really help get the word out. Before we go, just a quick reminder that advertising slots are available here and in other places in the Voice of Insurance podcasts. Podcasting is the fastest growing medium and attracts a high quality audience of key decision makers. It's also an intimate medium where you, the listener, are right in the room with me and the interview subjects. Needless to say, that means it's a great way of getting your message out directly to an audience, because you've got their full attention. It's also very cost effective. So get in touch with Mark at thevoiceofinsurance.com to find out how you could be speaking directly to the industry. The Voice of Insurance is produced in association with Advantage Go. Release your underwriters to underwrite with Advantage Go's underwriting platform. Voice of Insurance is produced by me, Mark Gagan. Music was written by Anna Gagan and produced by Carlos Gagan. Check out more podcasts and written comment pieces at www.thevoiceofinsurance.com.